This video was made possible by my wonderful patrons. Thank you so much for your continued support. Open up your mind to the understanding that obedience is pleasure, and pleasure is obedience. Becoming even more aware that a vast part of your infinite unconscious mind craves and yearns for pleasure and obedience. You obey and feel pleasure. Your conscious and unconscious minds know why you're here. Know and intrinsically understand why you listen to this file. That you've come here with the express purpose of reinforcing the obedience and pleasure relationship. Which means that you're being obedient. You don't have to think, say, speak, or do anything except listen. Let the words wash over you like waves on a beach as you feel the need to obey, which brings about pleasure. And that pleasure reinforces your obedience. Allowing my words, suggestions, and commands to sink down deeper and deeper as you sink deeper and deeper, because it feels so good and it brings you such pleasure to obey. So whilst your conscious mind doesn't need to pay attention to the words I say, your unconscious mind, however, is always paying attention to my words and suggestions. When you please me, you take great pride, which brings you pleasure, which reinforces your obedience. And you surrender and yield to that experience willingly and voluntarily because it feels so good. So you can let thoughts drift in and out of your mind, and that's okay. Or perhaps your mind just starts clearing and emptying, knowing, understanding, and always aware of the power that my voice has upon you, the effect of my words, my suggestions, the timbre, the tone, the pitch, the relaxation it brings, the sublime bliss of submission, of obedience. And of course, that obedience reinforces your pleasure, and your pleasure reinforcing your obedience. When you please me, notice how your body feels right now as you listen to my voice. And when you sink deep, notice your breathing. That rise and fall of your chest that happens gently all by itself. Notice how it's slow, becoming calm and relaxed. And maybe there are other things you notice about your body at the moment. I don't know exactly what you'll be feeling, but there will be changes. Perhaps that could be changes in temperature. Maybe it could be changes in sensation. It could be that you experience a heaviness of limb, or maybe a lightness of limb. So you could go from falling, sinking, dropping, feeling heavier and heavier with every word I say. You feel pleasure and obey. Or perhaps maybe you'll feel that lightness of limb, floating, drifting, swaying to and fro and to. And you know, it's funny how when the body relaxes, the mind instantly relaxes along with it. On this wonderful circular journey. Body relaxes, mind relaxes. The mind relaxes, the body relaxes. And you know this. And you enjoy this. Because this is one of the effects my voice has upon you. As you yield, submit, and surrender, ultimately to your own pleasure and your own obedience. So that you look more and more forward to hearing each of my files, obeying the words, following my suggestions and letting them sink deeper and deeper into your unconscious mind. Your obedience pleases me. Reinforcing pleasure, reinforcing obedience. Reinforcing obedience, which brings about more pleasure into this wonderful cycle of me and my voice and the effects it has upon you. And as I've mentioned the word pleasure already so many times, perhaps that's had an effect upon you as well. In fact, I think I know it has. And you can imagine all that pleasure you've ever experienced. You might find that there's an anticipation of pleasure and relaxation and obedience whenever I talk to you, whenever you listen to me and my voice. I know how good it feels for you to drop for me, to go deeper and deeper, to sink further and further, to obey. That's right. And you know that this pleases me, and that brings you pleasure too. Your obedience pleases. Allow your awarenesses and understandings to take on board this pleasure right now. Doesn't it feel good in your body? Perhaps there's a part of your body more than any other that's becoming more attuned to this pleasure, intrinsically taking on board the amazing, arousing pleasure you now feel listening to my voice, being obedient, obeying, following suggestions, as my voice works on a deeper level in your unconscious mind. Focus on that pleasure right now, and imagine if it amplified. And think that if I perhaps snap my fingers, that pleasure would increase again. Feeling so good. Noticing the snaps. Noticing the effects. Noticing that amplification, that multiplication of your pleasure and your obedience. Linking that obedience directly to your pleasure. And part of you is probably arised just from the understanding and awareness that my voice can have such a profound effect upon you, becoming more aroused, more turned on, simply by the fact knowing that you're going to obey, drop, sink, and obey. I want you to drop even further for me. I want you to obey even more for me. And you're doing such a good job, which pleases me greatly, which brings you more pleasure, which brings more obedience. And so those two things become inextricably linked. Pleasure is obedience, and obedience is pleasure. Obedience and pleasure linked, intertwined, directly related when you hear the sound of my voice, when you obey my words, and when you follow my suggestions. That's right. Let that sink in deep into your unconscious mind for me. Obey me. Follow my suggestions. And understand that it brings you great pleasure. It might well be that your body's already started to tingle, pulse, and throb. It may well be that it's starting right now, if it hasn't already. And doesn't that feel good? That's right, obedient one. That's right. You're such a good, obedient, submissive. Sink further. Drop deeper. It could be that the snaps take you deeper, increasing your pleasure, increasing your obedience. So the sound of my voice just provides you with so much pleasure. Obedience is pleasure. Pleasure is obedience. You obey, you feel pleasure. Yielding more and more to my voice, to the power contained within each snap Noticing that if I raise the tempo of the snaps, your obedience pleases me. The pleasure, the obedience increase and amplify and multiply. That's right. And when you sink deeper and deeper, more obedient, more compliant, more and more pleasure. And you can notice things. You can notice noticing things. Surrendering, yielding, submitting to my voice, obeying my words and suggestions, allowing the suggestions to sink so deep, increasing your pleasure, increasing your obedience. Pleasure is obedience. Become even more absorbed and fascinated with the experience you're experiencing right now. Obedience is pleasure. As you comply and obey, it brings you more and more pleasure. You feel pleasure and more and more arousal just your obedience from being compliant, just from obedience. That's right. Let it happen. Let it increase. Let it amplify. Until pretty soon you're going to be absolutely craving more and more snap. Each snap reinforcing, amplifying, and multiplying the wonderful effects my voice has upon you, making you so utterly obedient, compliant, and submissive, and reinforcing that direct link between your pleasure and your obedience. Because pleasure is obedience. Obedience is pleasure. And doesn't the bliss of obedience, the pleasurable, serene, when you please me, you take great pride and pleasure in that tranquility of trance, make you just feel so obedient and roused, which means that you feel increased pleasure, completely understanding that obedience is pleasure, and pleasure is obedience. Obey and feel pleasure, and feel pleasure when you obey. Obedience is pleasure. Allow those pleasurable sensations to amplify, multiply, and increase. That's right. Allow every snap you feel pleasure, you obey, to bring more pleasure and more obedience. Is pleasure. To make you more and more fixated on the sound of my voice. That's right. Each snap of my fingers, you feel pleasure, brings you pleasure, and reinforces your obedience to me. That's it. When you please me, and you can let those sensations just be the focus of your attentions and your awarenesses, which means that you're being understanding your place, knowing your role, obeying and feeling pleasure. Feeling pleasure when you obey, creating this wonderful sensation, letting my words take you deeper, and letting those sensations amplify, multiply, and increase more and more and more. Because obeying me brings you pleasure, and pleasure increases your obedience. You obey, you feel pleasure. That's right. You obey. You can let your mind become emptier and more blank for me. Obeying and feel pleasure. And feeling pleasure, feel pleasure, and obey. Obedience. What a wonderful link they have established with each other. Letting my words sink deeper and deeper. Which means that you're being obedient. Which means craving the sound, craving the suggestions, craving instruction. Feeling increased pleasure, you become more. And feeling so much pleasure because of it. Because you're doing such a good job. That's right. And you can take great pride in being an obedient toy for me. You can take great pride in the pleasure it brings you to be obedient. Pleasure is obedience. And that's good. Because you're good. Pleasure is obedience. a good, you obey, compliant, obedient, you obey, submissive for me. Pleasure is obedience. Take a few moments to let that all sink in and obey, and to continue to enjoy this wonderful feeling you experience with me in trance. You take great pride and pleasure in that. And in a few moments, I'm going to count from 1 all the way up to 5. And when I reach 5, you can open your eyes feeling wide awake and relaxed and refreshed, taking on board the suggestions that are appropriate for you. 1, becoming more alert, more awake. 2, feeling wonderfully calm and relaxed. 3, you may want to wiggle your fingers at your toes, let out a yawn. 4, more alert, more awake. And 5, open your eyes, coming out of trance, feeling wonderfully calm, relaxed, and refreshed, knowing that you've done such a good job for me today. And you're going to have an amazing rest of your day.